My ex said I'd always be broke. Then a dog changed everything. My name is Michael Carter, and I used to save lives. Now I save maybe $20 on my grocery bill if I'm lucky, work in the customs desk at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Funny how life works out, right? Back in Afghanistan, I worked with the best search and rescue dog in the world. These weren't your average pets. These were four-legged heroes with noses that could detect an IED buried 3 feet underground or find a wounded soldier in a collapsed building. Rex, my German Shepherd partner, had a success rate that made Navy SEALs jealous. We pulled 17 people out of rubble over 2 tours. 17 families got to hug their loved ones again because of what we did. These days, my world has shrunk to the smell of overpriced airport coffee, industrial-strength hand sanitizer, and the endless drone of gate announcements echoing through terminals that never sleep. Gate B7 now boarding. Gate C12 delayed indefinitely. Gate A15 last call. It's like being trapped inside a giant aluminum can with fluorescent lighting and carpet that's seen more foot traffic than Times Square on New Year's Eve. My old sergeant back in Kandahar, Sergeant Rodriguez, used to say something that stuck with me. Adapt or die, Carter. The desert doesn't care about your feelings. Turns out, the same rule applies here in civilian life. Except instead of Taliban insurgents, I'm dealing with tourists in socks and sandals who somehow think that combination is acceptable in public. The irony wasn't lost on me. I went from being part of elite rescue operations to stamping passports for people heading to Disney World. From life and death decisions to checking if someone remembered to declare their duty-free liquor. The transformation felt like going from being a surgeon to working the fry station at McDonald's. But hey, at least a McDonald's worker gets better benefits and doesn't have to deal with Karen from suburban Atlanta screaming about how her expired passport should still be valid because she's a tax-paying American citizen. The worst part wasn't even the mind-numbing routine or the fluorescent lights that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. The worst background noise wasn't the roar of Boeing 737s taking off every 3 minutes. No, the worst sound was the echo of words my ex-girlfriend Lauren had thrown at me exactly 1 year, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Michael, I can't keep carrying a washed-up veteran with debt and night terrors on my back. Those words had more stopping power than anything I'd encountered overseas. They played on repeat in my head while I mechanically stamped passport after passport, never looking up, never making eye contact. Stamp, next, stamp, next, like a broken robot program for one function. Lauren wasn't wrong, though that's what made it sting so much. The transition from military to civilian life had been about as smooth as landing a helicopter in a hurricane. The night terrors were real. The debt was real. The feeling of being completely lost in a world that seemed to function on entirely different rules. That was real too. I'd gone from having a clear mission, clear objectives, and clear brotherhood to this, sitting in a government-issued chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, stamping documents for people whose biggest worry was whether they'd packed enough sunscreen for their cruise. The American dream, right? Serve your country. Come home to a hero's welcome. Get a good job. Buy a house with a white picket fence. Marry the girl. Have 2.5 kids and a golden retriever. Reality check. More like serve your country. Come home to a thank you for your service that feels hollow. Struggle to find work that doesn't make you want to punch walls. Watch your relationship crumble. And end up living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbor's Netflix shows. But here's the thing about rock bottom. At least when you're there, you know which direction is up. I developed what I called the airport zombie shuffle. Clock in at 6 a.m., grab coffee that tasted like it was filtered through old gym socks, sit at desk number 7 in immigration processing, and begin the daily ritual of stamp, stamp, stamp until 6 p.m., rinse and repeat. Monday through Friday, sometimes weekends when they needed extra coverage. The faces became a blur. Business travelers in suits that cost more than my car. Families with screaming kids, enough luggage to relocate a small village. College kids backpacking through Europe with their parents' credit cards. Elderly couples finally taking that retirement trip they'd saved 40 years for. I perfected the art of looking busy while being completely mentally checked out. It's a skill they don't teach you in the military, but it's essential for survival in the civilian workplace. Nod occasionally. Make appropriate grunting sounds when supervisors walk by. Always have a pen in your hand. People assume you're doing something important if you're holding a pen. My supervisor, Janet, was the kind of person who probably practiced her "I need to speak to the manager" face in the mirror every morning. She had that particular brand of middle management energy that comes from having just enough authority to make other people's lives difficult, but not enough actual power to change anything meaningful. Janet loved rules. She lived for regulations. She probably had the entire TSA manual memorized and recited it in her sleep. She was the type who would write you up for being 30 seconds late to a job where literally nothing would happen if you weren't there. The thing about working in an airport is that you're surrounded by movement, by people going places, having adventures, starting new chapters of their lives. And you're just there, static, watching it all happen through bulletproof glass like you're an exhibit in a museum of bureaucratic mediocrity. Look, kids, that's a former military hero who now makes sure people didn't pack too many bottles of shampoo. I'd started making little mental games to pass the time. Count how many people were wearing flip-flops in December. Guess which couples were heading to weddings versus which ones were probably going to break up before the return flight. Try to spot the air marshals. Spoiler alert. They're usually the ones who look like accountants but walk like they've seen some serious action. But the game that really got to me was trying to figure out which dogs in the airport were working dogs and which ones were just pets. I could spot a trained dog from 50 yards away, the way they held their heads, the focus in their eyes, the confidence in their stride. It reminded me too much of Rex, and Rex reminded me too much of who I used to be. Working dogs have purpose. They have jobs that matter. They save lives, detect threats, provide comfort to people who need it most. They're not just existing. They're living with meaning. I was pretty sure I'd forgotten what that felt like. The routine had become so automatic that I could probably do it in my sleep. Check passport photos against person. Verify dates. Look for red flags, damaged documents, nervous behavior. Anything that seemed off. Stamp. Hand back. Next. It was mind-numbing work, but there was something almost meditative about it, like counting sheep, except the sheep were carrying luggage and complaining about baggage fees. Tuesdays started like every other day for the past 18 months. Coffee that could strip paint. Janet's morning briefing about new regulations that would make absolutely no difference to anyone. The steady stream of travelers ready to escape Atlanta for somewhere, anywhere else. I was deep in the zone, operating on autopilot, when something shifted. You know that feeling when you're driving the same route to work every day and suddenly you notice something different. A new building, a tree that's been cut down, a sign that wasn't there before? It was like that, but with people. I'd processed maybe 40 or 50 passports that morning without really seeing any of the faces. Stamp, stamp, stamp. The rhythm was hypnotic. But then I looked up, and for the first time in months, I actually saw someone. She was maybe late 20s, early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that spoke of long flights and longer stories. Auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she'd been traveling for a while. But it wasn't her that caught my attention. It was a dog beside her, an Australian shepherd with one brown eye and one blue eye, the kind of coloring that makes people stop and stare. But this wasn't a show dog or a pampered pet. This was a dog with purpose, with intelligence that seemed almost human. The way she sat perfectly still beside her owner, alert but not anxious, reminded me so much of Rex that I felt something crack inside my chest. The woman approached my window, passport in hand, and our eyes met for just a second. In that moment, I saw something I recognized, the look of someone who was carrying more than just luggage. The look of someone who understood that sometimes life takes everything you thought you knew about yourself and throws it in the garbage. Her dog's eyes met mine too, and I swear that animal saw right through me. Dogs have this ability to look at you and see not just who you are in that moment, but who you used to be and who you could become again. It's unsettling and comforting at the same time. For the first time in months, I felt something other than numb. Something was about to change. I could feel it in the air, the way you can feel a storm coming before you see the clouds. I just had no idea that this moment, this simple exchange of glances with a tired woman and her remarkable dog, was about to turn my carefully constructed world of controlled misery completely upside down. That moment of connection, that split second where I actually felt human again, lasted about as long as a Super Bowl commercial break. Because what happened next turned my already upside-down world into a complete dumpster fire. The woman stepped up to my window, and I could see her passport trembling slightly in her hand. First-time international traveler, maybe, or just someone who'd had one of those flights where you question every life choice that led you being 30,000 feet in the air in a metal tube. I took her passport and glanced at the name. Amanda Brooks, Australian visa, returning to the States. Clean documentation, nothing suspicious. But it was her dog that kept drawing my attention. This wasn't just any dog. This was Daisy, as I'd learned later, and she was like a ray of actual sunlight in this kingdom of artificial lighting and recycled air. She sat with perfect posture beside Amanda, but I could tell she was tired. Those mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, kept scanning the terminal with the kind of alertness that reminded me of working dogs I'd known. Everything about Daisy screamed intelligence and training. The way she positioned herself slightly in front of Amanda. How she kept her ears tuned to every sound around them. This wasn't a pet flying cargo. This was a companion animal, probably a service dog, and she was clearly stressed by the airport environment. I was just about to stamp Amanda's passport and send them on their way when the universe decided to remind me that it has a twisted sense of humor. You know how in movies, disaster always strikes at the worst possible moment? Real life is exactly like that, except there's no soundtrack to warn you it's coming. A baggage cart being pushed by some guy who was clearly texting while working hit a metal crowd control barrier about 20 feet away. The crash was loud enough to wake the dead and sharp enough to make everyone in the immediate area jump out of their skin. For most people, it was just a startling noise. For Daisy, it was apparently the trigger for every anxiety she'd been holding back during what was probably a very long journey. She bolted, not in a random, panic way, but with the kind of purposeful terror that comes from a dog who's been trained to respond to threats, but doesn't understand that this particular loud noise isn't dangerous. The leash slipped right out of Amanda's hands, and suddenly we had a 60-pound Australian shepherd running loose in one of the busiest airports in the world. The reaction was immediate and predictably over the top. You'd have thought a tiger had escaped from the zoo. Security guards started shouting into their radios. Travelers began backing away like Daisy was carrying some kind of contagious disease. A lady with bedazzled "Live, Laugh, Love" t-shirt actually climbed onto a chair and started screaming about rabies. Janet appeared out of nowhere, like she'd been summoned by the chaos itself. She was already barking orders before she'd even assessed the situation, which was classic Janet. Protocol first, common sense never. The airport's emergency response protocol for loose animals is apparently designed by people who've never actually met an animal. Step 1, establish a perimeter. Step 2, call animal control. Step 3, treat the situation like a biological hazard until proven otherwise. What they saw was a potential threat to be contained. What I saw was a scared, exhausted dog who just wanted to find somewhere safe to hide. Daisy had backed herself into a corner near the departure gates, panting heavily and looking around with those mismatched eyes like she couldn't understand why all these humans were suddenly acting crazy. She wasn't aggressive. Anyone who'd spent 5 minutes around dogs could see that. She was terrified. Amanda was crying and trying to get past the security guards who'd formed what they probably thought was a tactical formation, but really looked more like a middle school soccer defense. She kept calling Daisy's name, which was only making the dog more anxious because she could hear the distress in her owner's voice. This was where my military training kicked in, specifically the part about rapid situation assessment and the ability to see what actually needs to happen versus what the manual says should happen. My old canine instructor at Lackland Air Force Base, Staff Sergeant Martinez, had drilled one thing into our heads over and over. Dogs don't speak English. They speak energy. If you're calm, they're calm. If you're freaking out, they're going to freak out too. The golden rule of approaching a stressed animal is actually pretty simple. Never walk directly toward them. Never make direct eye contact. Make yourself smaller and speak in low, calm tones. Dogs interpret direct approaches as threats, eye contact as challenges, and loud voices as aggression. Everything the security team was doing wrong, I knew how to do right. I looked at Janet, who was coordinating with animal control on her radio like we were dealing with an escaped grizzly bear. I looked at the security guards, who were clearly out of their depth. I looked at Amanda, whose distress was only making Daisy more panicked. Then I looked at Daisy, cowering in the corner, and made a decision that would change everything. I stepped out from behind my desk. Janet noticed immediately and held up her hand like a traffic cop. The look on her face could have stopped a charging rhino. But I'd made my choice, and for the first time in 18 months, it felt like the right one. I ignored Janet's increasingly frantic gestures and the security guard's confused looks. I slowly walked toward Daisy, but not directly. I took a wide arc, keeping my body turned slightly away from her, making myself as non-threatening as possible. When I got within about 10 feet, I crouched down, making myself smaller. I didn't look directly at her. Instead, I looked just past her, the way you do when you're trying not to spook a wild animal. Then I started talking to her in the low, calm voice I'd used with Rex and dozens of other working dogs over the years. Not baby talk, not excited chatter, just steady, reassuring human sounds that said, "I'm not a threat, I'm here to help." The change in Daisy was almost immediate. Her panting slowed down. Her ears, which had been pinned back in fear, started to relax. She was still scared, but she was beginning to recognize that I was different from all the other humans who'd been treating her like a dangerous animal. I extended my hand, palm up, letting her catch my scent. This is crucial. You never reach toward a scared dog. You let them come to you. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only about 30 seconds, Daisy took a tentative step forward and sniffed my fingers. That's when I knew we'd connected. Moving slowly and deliberately, I reached for her leash, which was still attached to her collar. She let me clip it back on without resistance. The whole thing had taken maybe 90 seconds from start to finish. The terminal, which had been buzzing with tension and confused chatter, went completely silent for a moment. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, people started clapping. I stood up and walked Daisy back to Amanda, who was looking at me like I'd just performed some kind of miracle. The gratitude in her eyes was the first genuine human connection I'd felt in months. But as I handed the leash back to Amanda, I noticed Janet pushing through the crowd with the kind of expression that suggested my brief moment of heroism was about to become a career-ending mistake. The next few minutes felt like watching a car accident in slow motion. Janet's face had gone through several colors before settling on a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. She waited until Amanda and Daisy had been escorted to their gate before pulling me aside. The conversation that followed was one of those moments where you realize that doing the right thing and following the rules are sometimes mutually exclusive. Apparently, what I'd done was a clear violation of Rule 17b in the Airport Security Manual. Physical contact with non-service animals by security personnel is strictly prohibited without proper authorization and animal control supervision. Rule 17b. 26 words that somehow manage to turn an act of basic human decency into a fireable offense. Janet explained this to me in the kind of voice people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while doing something completely unreasonable. She had to write me up. She said, it was policy. Her hands were tied. I want to point out that Daisy was clearly a service animal, that the situation had been resolved quickly and safely, that sometimes common sense should override bureaucratic nonsense. But I could see in Janet's eyes that she'd already made up her mind. This was the excuse she'd been waiting for. Let me tell you something about middle management in large organizations. They live for moments like this, moments where they can exercise the tiny amount of power they have while hiding behind rules and regulations. Janet had probably been looking for a reason to get rid of me since day one, and I just handed it to her on a silver platter. The meeting in her office 2 hours later was a formality. Janet sat behind her desk with a folder full of paperwork that had clearly been prepared in advance. She read from what sounded like a script, using phrases like violation of protocol and failure to follow proper procedures. I was terminated effective immediately. Just like that, 18 months of mind-numbing routine came to an end. No ceremony. No appreciation for the fact that I resolved a potentially dangerous situation without anyone getting hurt. Just a security escort to my locker to collect my personal items and a final paycheck that would barely cover my rent. The drive home felt like being transported back in time to the worst days after my discharge from the military. That same feeling of being untethered, of having the ground disappear beneath your feet when you thought you finally had your footing. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for almost an hour, staring at the building and trying to process what had just happened. My apartment was exactly what you'd expect for someone living paycheck to paycheck in Atlanta. A studio with walls so thin I could hear my neighbors' conversations word for word. A kitchenette that was really just a hot plate and a mini fridge pretending to be a real kitchen. A Murphy bed that I'd gotten from a guy on Craigslist who swore it only fell down randomly maybe once a month. I sat on that unreliable bed and stared at the termination paperwork Janet had given me. The official reason was listed as violation of safety protocols resulting in unauthorized animal contact. What it should have said was showed basic human compassion in a situation where bureaucracy demanded indifference. That's when Lauren's words came flooding back with the force of a freight train. Washed-up veteran with debt and night terrors. She'd been right about the debt part, and now the situation had gotten significantly worse. I'd saved Daisy, but I couldn't save myself. I'd done the right thing, but the right thing had cost me the only source of income one had. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. In Afghanistan, quick thinking and decisive action saved lives and earned commendations. In civilian life, the same instincts got you fired. 2 days later, I was sitting at my kitchen table, which was really just a TV tray that had seen better days, staring at an eviction notice that had appeared on my door like some kind of cruel magic trick. 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent, plus late fees, plus the monthly amount due. The total came to more than I had made in the last 6 months combined. The notice was printed on standard white paper, probably from some lawyer's office downtown, but it felt heavier in my hands than any piece of military equipment I'd ever carried. Heavier than my pack during 20-mile training hikes. Heavier than my body armor during patrol sweeps in Kandahar. I set the notice down on the table and looked around my studio apartment. Not much to show for 32 years of life. A few books, some old military gear I couldn't bring myself to throw away, a coffee maker that only worked when you hit it in exactly the right spot. The walls were bare except for one photo. Me and Rex after a successful rescue mission, both of us covered in dust, but grinning like we just won the lottery. Back when I had a purpose. Back when what I did mattered. Now I was about to lose even this tiny space that barely qualified as a home. The silence in the apartment was deafening. No airport announcements. No machinery humming. No voices of coworkers complaining about overtime. Just me, alone with the sound of my own breathing and the occasional car passing by outside. I thought about calling someone, but who? My family back in Ohio had their own problems. The few military buddies I still kept in touch with were scattered across the country, dealing with their own post-service struggles. Lauren had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with my baggage. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt completely and utterly alone. The eviction notice sat there on the table like an accusation, like proof that Lauren had been right all along. I was a washed-up veteran who couldn't make it in the real world. I'd lost my military career to an injury that ended my dog-handling days. I'd lost my relationship to debt and night terrors. I'd lost my job to a moment of basic human decency. What was left? I picked up the eviction notice again, feeling its weight. This piece of paper represented more than just the loss of my apartment. It was evidence of a complete system failure. The failure of a guy who used to save lives, to save even himself. Outside my window, Atlanta hummed with life. People going to jobs they might actually enjoy. Families heading out for dinner at restaurants they could afford. Students walking to classes that would lead to careers with actual futures. All of them moving forward while I sat still, holding a piece of paper that proved I couldn't even maintain the most basic requirement of adult life. Keeping a roof over my head. The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd hit rock bottom, so hard I was pretty sure I'd cracked the foundation. But sometimes, when you're at the very bottom, when there's literally nowhere left to fall, that's when the universe decides to surprise you in ways you never saw coming. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that's so twisted it borders on genius. Just when you think you've hit rock bottom and start making friends with the concrete, life decides to throw you the most unexpected curveball imaginable. I was 3 days into my new career as a professional failure, sorting through my old military gear to see what I could sell on eBay, when I heard a car pull up outside my apartment. Not unusual. People came and went from this complex like it was a revolving door. But something made me look out the window. A modest Ford Fusion sat in the parking lot, and getting out of it was the last person I expected to see again. Amanda Brooks stood there looking around like she wasn't quite sure she had the right place. Can't say I blamed her. My apartment complex wasn't exactly the kind of neighborhood where people drove Fusions that still had all their hubcaps. She spotted my window and waved. Actually waved, like we were old friends instead of two people who'd shared exactly 90 seconds of crisis management in an airport terminal. I threw on a clean shirt. Well, cleaner than the one I'd been wearing for 2 days, and headed downstairs, wondering if I was hallucinating from too much ramen and not enough sleep. Amanda was standing next to her car with Daisy, who looked significantly more relaxed than the last time I'd seen her. The dog's tail actually wagged when she saw me, which did something weird in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. What Amanda told me next was like something out of a movie, except movies usually make more sense. She'd spent the better part of a week tracking me down. My former supervisor, Janet, had refused to give out any contact information, citing privacy policies, and probably hoping I'd disappear into the ether, where failed airport employees go to die. But Amanda was a lawyer, and lawyers are basically professional problem solvers with law degrees and an unhealthy relationship with paperwork. She'd called Janet back and explained that she wanted to send an official thank you letter to me on behalf of her law firm for professional manner in which I'd handled an emergency situation involving her service animal. Suddenly, Janet was more than happy to provide my contact information. Bureaucrats, man. They'll stonewall you all day until you mention official letters and legal firms. Then they practically trip over themselves to be helpful. But here's where the story gets interesting. Amanda wasn't just there to say thanks. She was there to offer me a job. Turns out, Amanda had been thinking about what happened at the airport for days. Not just the incident with Daisy, but the way I'd handled it. The calm approach, the understanding of animal behavior, the ability to see past the chaos to what actually needed to happen. She'd been working on a business plan for months, a startup focused on safe, stress-free transportation for pets and service animals. The idea had come to her after horror stories about animals dying in cargo holds, getting lost during transfers, or being traumatized by standard shipping procedures. The market was there. Pet owners spend billions of dollars a year on their animals, and air travel for pets was still stuck in the Stone Age. But she needed someone who understood both logistics and animal behavior. Someone like me. The offer was straightforward and terrifying in equal measure. Partnership in a startup called Paws, focused on revolutionizing pet transportation. My role will be head of safety and animal welfare, developing protocols and training programs. The catch? There was no salary, no benefits, no guaranteed income, just equity in a company that existed mainly as a business plan and a website Amanda had built using a template she'd found online. Oh, and the office was a garage. I should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. I was broke, facing eviction, and had exactly zero experience running a business. The smart move would have been to thank her politely and continue my job search in fields where I actually had relevant experience. But standing there in that parking lot, with Daisy looking at me like she remembered our moment of connection, something inside me shifted. For the first time since leaving the military, someone was asking me to use the skills I'd actually developed instead of just filling a slot in some bureaucratic machine. I said yes. Let me tell you something about startup life. It makes military service look like a vacation at a luxury resort. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, fueled by coffee that could strip paint and the kind of determination that borders on insanity. Amanda's garage became our headquarters, conference room, and warehouse all rolled into one. She handled the legal and business side, while I dove into the operational challenges of moving animals safely across the country. It turns out that designing safe transport for pets is like solving a three-dimensional puzzle where every piece is different and some of them bite. I spent weeks researching everything from optimal ventilation systems to the psychological effects of different lighting on various dog breeds. I studied cargo hold temperatures, developed feeding schedules for different flight durations, and created protocols for handling everything from anxiety-prone cats to exotic birds that cost more than most people's cars. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from planning military operations in the Afghan desert to calculating the ideal timing for a corgi's bathroom break before a 10-hour flight to London. But for the first time in years, I felt like my brain was actually being used for something meaningful. The first few months were brutal. We were bootstrapping everything with Amanda's savings and whatever I could contribute from selling my military gear. Our biggest expense was gas money for driving around to pet stores, veterinary clinics, and animal shelters, trying to convince people that our idea wasn't completely crazy. Most of them thought it was exactly that. Crazy. The established pet shipping companies have been doing things the same way for decades. Airlines treated pet cargo as an afterthought. Pet owners just accepted that flying with their animals meant stress, risk, and crossing their fingers that nothing went wrong. But we kept hearing the same stories over and over. Pets arriving traumatized. Animals getting lost during connections. Heartbroken families whose beloved companions didn't survive the journey. That's when I realized we weren't just building a business. We were solving a problem that actually mattered to people. Our first real client was a military family being transferred from Fort Benning to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. They had 2 dogs and a cat, and the standard military pet relocation service had them jumping through so many hoops that the process was going to take 3 months and cost nearly $5,000. We promised to do it in 2 weeks for half the cost, with regular updates and a guarantee that their pets would be treated like family members, not cargo. I threw everything I had into that first job: military logistics training, animal behavior knowledge, and the kind of attention to detail that comes from years of knowing that mistakes can cost lives. We created custom travel crates designed for comfort and security, developed a feeding and exercise schedule that minimized stress during travel, arranged for veterinary checks at every stop, set up a communication system so the family could track their pet's journey in real time. It was exhausting, expensive, and probably not sustainable as a business model, but it worked perfectly. The pets arrived in Germany healthy, calm, and ready to explore their new home. The family was so grateful they wrote testimonials, posted reviews online, and referred us to 3 other military families facing similar relocations. More importantly, I realized something that had been missing from my life since leaving the service. I had found my mission again. We weren't just moving animals from point A to point B. We were keeping families together. We were reducing suffering. We were solving problems that other people either couldn't or wouldn't tackle. And apparently, we were really good at it. Word spread through military communities first, then expanded to civilians dealing with international relocations, families moving across country, and people who'd adopted rescue animals from distant locations. Each job taught us something new. We refined our processes, expanded our network of trusted veterinarians and transportation partners, and slowly built a reputation for being the people who could handle the impossible cases. The breakthrough came about 8 months in, when we got a call from a Hollywood producer who needed to transport 6 exotic animals for a movie being filmed in 3 different countries. The insurance requirements alone were enough to make most companies run away screaming. We took the job and executed it flawlessly. That success led to contract with major film studios, international corporations relocating executive families, and eventually partnerships with airlines that wanted to offer premium pet transportation services. 2 years after starting Amanda's Garage, we moved into actual office space. 6 months after that, we hired our first employees. A year later, we were fielding inquiries from investors who wanted to help us scale nationally. The The company that had started as a desperate idea between two people who connected over a scared dog in an airport was becoming something real. But the real transformation wasn't in the business. It was in me. For the first time since my discharge in the military, I woke up every morning with a sense of purpose. I was using skills I developed over years of training and experience. I was solving complex logistical challenges that required both technical knowledge and creative thinking. Most importantly, I was making a difference in people's lives in a way that felt meaningful and sustainable. The night terrors that had plagued me since leaving Afghanistan gradually faded. The constant anxiety about money and future planning was replaced by the kind of focused stress that comes from building something worthwhile. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was actually living. 5 years later, I found myself standing on a stage in Los Angeles International Airport, looking out at an audience of airline executives, investors, and journalists who'd come to witness the grand opening of the first dedicated Safe Paws animal transit facility. Our garage startup had become Safe Paws Logistics, a company valued at over $50 million with facilities in 12 major airports and partnerships with every major airline in North America. The terminal behind me was everything I dreamed of during those 18-hour days in Amanda's garage. Climate-controlled environments designed specifically for animal comfort, trained staff who understood pet psychology, veterinary facilities for health checks and emergency care, exercise areas where animals could stretch and play during layovers. A journalist from CNN raised her hand and asked the question I'd been expecting. "Mr. Carter, what's the secret to your success?" I looked out at the crowd of people in expensive suits, representatives from airlines and logistics companies, investors who were probably already calculating their next moves in the growing pet services market. Then I gave them an answer that was completely honest and probably not what they expected. A few years ago, I got fired from this very airport for calming down a scared dog. I was told I had violated Rule 17B of the Airport Security Manual. Well, it turns out that compassion isn't a violation. It's a business model worth tens of millions of dollars. So my secret is simple. Never let bureaucrats tell you where your heart belongs. The audience laughed and applauded, probably thinking I was being charming for the cameras. But I was dead serious. That's when I saw her, standing in the back of the crowd, wearing a flight attendant's uniform that I recognized from one of the major carriers. Lauren. Our eyes met across the room, and I could see a mixture of shock, recognition, and something that might have been regret. She looked exactly the same, maybe a little older around the eyes, but still the woman who'd walked out of my life when things got difficult. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I could almost hear her voice from that night years ago, washed-up veteran with debt and night terrors. She was waiting for me to approach her, expecting it. Maybe the old Michael probably would have excused himself from the stage and made his way through the crowd to have that awkward conversation about how things had turned out. But I wasn't the same person she'd left behind. Instead, I finished answering the journalist's follow-up questions, smiled for a few more photos, and stepped down from the stage. As I moved through the crowd, I stopped next to a golden retriever wearing a service vest, one of the therapy dogs from our new program designed specifically to help veterans transition to civilian life. I knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the same way I used to with Rex all those years ago. The dog's tail wagged, and for a moment, everything felt complete. When I stood up, Lauren was still there, still watching. I gave her a slight nod, acknowledgement without invitation, and walked toward the exit. I didn't owe her an explanation. I didn't owe her my attention. I didn't owe her anything at all. The best revenge isn't proving something to someone who doubted you. It's proving everything to yourself. My night terrors were gone. My debt was ancient history. My purpose was clear and my future was bright. I walked out of that terminal and into my new life, leaving the past exactly where it belonged behind me,